let's see which one. Let's try this one. Does that work? Yes. Is that working? Yes.
Yes, yes, it is visible now.
You're going to want to swap displays again.
Yeah, yeah.
How's that? Is that good? I got so much on my screen, so I need to know, is that good? Can people see the screen? Someone unmute and tell me if they can see the screen.
We can see your presenter
Yeah,
screen.
we are able to see the screen, but your next screen also is being shown. So I don't think you want to show us the next screen also. You want to show us only the present one, right?
Yeah. Okay, which means, sorry, let me think just a minute how I can do that. But that's like the swapping. Isn't that better then?
No, it is the same.
Don't really know what to do. In the chat room, by the way, people, there's a link to the slides. I put the slides in ResearchGate if people want a copy of the slides. I'm not sure what to do here, but let me see if this helps. Does that help? When I lose everybody. Sorry for the confusion. I should really know how to do this by now, but apparently I don't. So how does that screen look? Help, I need some help.
We don't see any slides actually. We just see the your picture actually. Maybe you have also a second.
Yeah.
Working. Yeah, great.
Is that better?
Yeah.
Yes.
Let me just go with that.
Can you go on the slide show mode?
Say that again?
Slide show mode, yeah.
From beginning, yeah.
Slide show. Click on slide show. There is a tab on slide show.
There.
Right.
Yes, perfect.
Yay, thank you for that tip. I should know that, but it's been a while. So all right, let me see if I can get going here. Good, my slides are going forward. So let me tell you a little bit about what we're going to do today and what I hope to achieve today. I really want to introduce to you the idea of using visual displays, most notably the kinds that integrate qualitative and quantitative data or findings in your own research. So I'm hoping that some of the examples that I give you will be useful to you in your own research if you adapt it. I'm not trying to propose that any of these can only be formatted in one way. Instead, I really want to suggest to you their use as a starting point, a spring point for ideas. So before we really get into it, let me say a couple more things. I like to take questions at multiple points. So as we move from one section to the other, I'll pause and ask Rebecca to see if there are questions. So some of the visuals that I present naturally are pretty dense on the screen and hard to make much sense of, perhaps when you just look at them closely because many of these are complex displays. And so pop questions in the chat box to clarify because others will have very similar questions. So I'm just trying to spark ideas about using visuals using visuals at many points in the research process. We tend to think of them strictly in terms of reporting. So let me try to go forward. So here are some of my aims. I want to present to you a little bit of background, which could seem kind of intellectual or esoteric, because one of the things about joint displays, the combination when you integrate qual and quant, it's a relatively new topic in mixed methods research. It's very prominent now because of its role as a very ready tool to integrate. So it's become like one of the principal ways to integrate data. So there have been subtle changes in the way the few people really writing about joint displays have talked about them. And I want to talk to you about that only to invite you to think about them as an area of research for yourself. So I mentioned that I wanted to provide innovative examples. I'm going to refrain from showing you too many during data collection, but I happen to think that using visuals during data collection is a way to reach a broader audience and get more authentic data. So I'll also talk about this third bullet, which really is where my interest and excitement resides, and that is in using them as a mixed method analytical tool. I've always been a little reluctant to refer to mixed data and mixed analysis, but I do that in this context. And then I want to explore some of the implications to conventional views about mixed methods when you get into thinking you could use a joint display for analysis. Let me just tell you a little bit about myself from a history of 3 books that I've written or am writing. I was an academic for, I regret to say, 38 years, and then I retired. And I've always been very, very interested in writing. It's very prominent in what I love to do. And I found that I really loved textbooks, even though when I was a faculty member, people discouraged me from writing textbooks. So there were 3 that I've written. The first one is a broad, all-encompassing one, which you see at the center, an introduction to fully integrated research. And I left that book thinking, oh, why don't we write more about mixed methods and grounded theory or mixed methods and case study? And that led to my second book that was just published this July by Rutledge, and that's it's a mixed methods approach to grounded theory. It has one chapter about using visual displays with theory that really was the springboard for the newest book that I'm writing, which has the 4 hands. So this is pairing of 2 methods, and then this new book is really looking at visual displays across what they call inter-method mixing and mixed methods, combining mixed methods with other methods. So let me look in the chat box and ask you a question. How many of you, is this your first mixed methods conference? So enter in the chat box. Yes, and I want to know where you're from. So how many, okay, I see a few where it's yes, the first. Yes, I see, yeah, great. Oh yeah, look, this is great. Not Dallas. Hey Dallas, I know Dallas, he was on the board with me. So let me suggest something to you I'm going to go off script a little bit here and just, for those of you who are new to the Mixed Methods International Research Association and its conferences, I was president of the Mixed Methods International Research Association, I guess 3 presidents back, or two and a half presidents back. And one of the things I want to warn you about, I don't know if this is your first workshop or your second workshop, but when you get almost anyone who attends a Mixed Methods International Conference, there's also a very active SIG in the American Educational Research Association. But at the Mixed Methods conferences, and I've been to, I think, 3 or 4 in-person conferences, new attendees often sort of walk out of their first room, their first meeting room with a dazed look in their eye, because they've been reading about mixed methods, but they had no idea that people have such different views about it. So one of the things I wanted to just tip you off is to suggest you're going to hear, the more sessions you attend, you're going to hear very different perspectives about mixed methods. And the advantage of that, in my view, is that it really lets you consider your own priorities and what is of most interest to you. Most people, let me talk briefly about these 4 before we return, these 4 domains, 5 domains. There's some new ones emerging. But you'll see that there's a whole cluster or camp of people that are in the design camp. In their mind, design comes first. You pick the design first. The purpose camp, this is where I would put Jennifer Green, a colleague and someone whose views have influenced me, really downplay design as a secondary issue to your purpose. And this becomes even more important when your purpose is action research or you're trying to promote social change. This is very, very important. For a long time, there was a lot of discussion about paradigm in the literature about mixed methods. One thing I can tell you about mixed methods, it's used from many different paradigms. This, I think, is sort of fading away as recognition of its diversity. The integration camp has been lived in mostly by Pat Baisley all by herself since about 1995, and some of you may have done a workshop with her first. She was in on the founding of MMIRA. I live in this camp, in the integration camp. I'm very interested in creative ways to bring qualitative data and qualitative and quantitative data and findings together. Mertens has been home, was for a long time, almost the solitary voice in this quadrant, talking about transformative feminist participatory research. This is a different group of priorities. It's closer to purpose than it is to design. So I present this to you and pop questions, because we can come back to this, to try to understand people prioritize different things about mixed methods. I prioritize integration as the chief reason people do mixed methods as compared to multi-methods. I think you have to hit the slide. So when we talk about visual displays, let me start from broad to narrow. So visual display is the broadest term. It includes tables, figures, diagrams, matrices. Some people would put photos in there. That's not a topic that I deal very much with. There are books on that, using photos to collect data, analyzing photos. So that's the broadest umbrella term. A joint display is one type of visual display that it's a figure table that contains both qualitative and quantitative data or components. This is what people in mixed methods have concentrated on. I suggest that it's important to suggest a different type of joint display, a more complex joint display called an integrated display that generates insight that's used in analysis. So most joint displays, and I'll show you these in a minute, they're an endpoint. It's like the back door out of a study, an endpoint. I'm not going to read most of this about the advantages of visual displays. The point is to think of them. My priority is to think of them to help you think in a more multidimensional and holistic way about your phenomena or constructs. Eventually, you've got to refine it to think about people who are looking at them. But if most of you have ever used diagramming, if you ever find yourself sketching out an idea, trying to think about it, theoretically, you could say, that's the part of visual displays that really interests me the most. So let's go through what may seem like very minor differences about joint displays. And I bring this up primarily to emphasize how new this discussion is. Now, you may not think it's new when I point to 2011 as the place that it started to emerge. And that to you may seem like 11 years ago, which it is, that's accurate. But if you think of the mixed methods literature as beginning to emerge late 90s, early 2000s, we were well past the first generation before you get into talking about joint displays. Many of the early textbooks didn't talk very much about integration and how to do it. So this mention in 2011 in the second edition of Creswell and Plano Clark was inspired by one example by a colleague of theirs in the medical profession, Wintick, Gallo, and Barge. They're collaborators, so perhaps they produce them interactively. Later on, so they began with this idea of them pretty much as the back door, aligning qual and quant findings, and I'll give you many examples, and then sort of ending with meta inferences. So Guterman and his colleagues continue to publish about joint displays, really still largely focusing on the back door. Plano, Clark, and Sanders, and I have this reference list on my last slide, did a publication which has really made a big contribution, but I think it's in a venue that it hasn't gotten very much attention. So they began talking about different types of joint displays and probably introduced a vocabulary of 5 to 10 different types that have yet really to become part of the mainstream discussion. Then later on, very recently, there's been quite a bit of activity in thinking about using visual displays or a series of visual displays for what is called case-based analysis. So the move from thinking about them as merging data, raw, to thinking about them as a series of interlinked is one of the things I want to talk about today. And then I've concentrated on using them to advance theory development. So let's look at some very simple displays, and I'll do a couple of these and then stop for questions before we get to more complex. But here's a very conventional, if I could say, side-by-side display, a joint display. All right. It's theoretical in that you have constructs here, and then they often include illustrative quotes. And then that's actually not, it is, let me see if I can. I can't see the right column. But usually this is a theoretical joint display. Oh, okay, this is from Howell and Smith. It's an instrument development display. It's got your qual constructs and how they were, so this is a instrument development display. The point is the data are aligned side by side. It's an endpoint. So we started with these constructs. Here's an illustration of where we got the construct to sort of warrant it. And here are our survey items. This is probably an example of a fairly formulaic display. So Castro, and this was pretty radical for the time, 2019. No, actually, this is Johnson. I'm sorry, let me go back. So here in 2019, Johnson and her colleagues coined the expression pillar integration or pillar building themes. And in this case, what they've done is devoted a middle column to meta inferences. And the inference issue is where you really see the difference between basic and joint displays. So whether you put this column in the center and follow Johnson's model, or you put this column out here and call them meta inferences, which is more standard, this is your bread and butter joint display. It might appear in the discussion section of a paper, sometimes in the results section. You see it's aligning qual and quant data, and it's generating conclusions when you look at them together. So by putting them side by side, the data on the same constructs, or in this case, it's the same schools, you generate a new level of synthetic insight. Usually that's it, that's the end, excuse me, you stop there. I think in mixed methods, there's a very big fear, paradigmatically grounded, of moving past this step. It's like you put them together, you draw some conclusions, but there's a huge reluctance to go much past that. So in, when was Castro? 2016, something like that. He published an article using a format that I found out later he's used in several articles that was like a big advance, because this is still a joint display. It's still a basic display. It still stops short of further analysis, but this was added to the discussion, and this is a powerful joint display because he has scores in this case on a survey instrument about life satisfaction. And he's aligned his qualitative data, he sorted it. If you imagine yourself in an Excel spreadsheet and you've got your qual data here, and you know the person's score on your variables of interest, whether it be well-being, in this case it's satisfaction, you can sort them and then see what patterns you see. So in his case, his meta inferences are on the right here. And he has a very tidy display here, and that his findings lined up pretty clearly. And he found big differences on his core construct, which related to machismo from those who scored high on life satisfaction and those who scored low. Again, doesn't go on to a next step, which would make this research even richer if, for instance, you went on to do case studies of people in storyline 1 and people in storyline 2. It's like it leaves thought about the conclusions, thought about inferences to the reader. This is a very strong joint display, well worth emulating, useful in many contexts. So many of you might find this helpful. Here's another one that's very simple, that has a time dimension. So it's still combining, well, it's quantifying really. It's quantifying qual themes, and it's showing how those themes changed over time. Let me talk you a little bit more about that, and I think in a few slides I'll open up to questions. This is a really creative study that used a private Facebook page, recruited participants who were at risk for HIV, and it's trying to use the Facebook page to encourage, to educate people to pursue, in order that they would learn more about HIV and testing. So they coded the data in the Facebook page. Anyone could do this in any social media. That has, the Facebook has a timestamp. So they went in weekly and had discussions with their participants. This could work with a class as well. And then they coded their response and showed how the topic, the amount of conversation, so it's quantifying the amount of conversation by topic at 3 different points of time. So you can see, if you just look at the left-hand top one, over time, the amount of posting related to prevention and testing increased dramatically. So they achieved their goal. Knowledge, however, is kind of uneven on the one to the right. So that's important to explain. And then the friendly conversation, not surprisingly, decreased. So here's a crude, no, that's the wrong word. Here's a effective way to show change over 3 points of time with a joint display. And this was something that appeared in a journal about sexually transmitted diseases, so pretty far flung. So let's go back and stop, because I'm going to shift, as you could see by this next picture, to complex displays. So let's see in the chat, before we go on, my next question to you. Yes, you're finding those slides. Okay. Questions, comments, any one of another thing to post in the chat is any one of these might be useful to you if you don't want to post a question. So I'm looking at the chat box. Hey, Dallas. Interesting question from Ramona. I like the way you're thinking. She raises a very important question. Yes, okay. So Ramona says, in an explanatory design, so that means it begins quant, does the survey questionnaire have to align to the interview questions to do a joint display? No. You can have a line that shows that these variables or ideas came up, but you could add credibility to your table by saying perhaps they're not relevant to your principal question. So you could in the surrounding text say these are some of the topics that came up, but they're not included in the survey. We didn't turn them into survey items because they're not, one sentence or something. You can also include the vice versa. Have some survey items that may be strongly related to your theory, but didn't appear in your qualitative data. That's assuming you have both. So yes, Ramona, and again, all of these tables have to be adapted and become interesting when they're adapted to your circumstance. So you start with this idea of a shell, and then you tweak the shell to make it work for you, make it work to communicate for you and for your reader. That's a really good question. Yeah, Jose, you're really right. This is really where integration comes alive. And some of my examples later about case-based really moves it into a whole new domain. So remember, this is still an evolving field. The language of joint displays is kind of specific to the mixed methods insiders, like in your own disciplinary journals, it may not be widely recognized. You're welcome. So let's go on now and tangle up our brains with complex displays. This one is from POF. Now, let me say first that when I remember back at a conference, it could have been the New Zealand conference. It was a great New Zealand conference. It was the last very good conference, the last MMIRA conference, last conference I went to before COVID. I think it was December 2019. And I saw someone put up a display that was as complicated as this, and I thought, what happened to the recommendation that displays be simple and that they communicate a clear point and that they be parsimonious? So I was using sort of those what I consider old-fashioned first generation literature and mixed methods. Keep it simple. Have a clear storyline. One of the reasons that has changed, the complexity has been added, is because a figure like this from POF, a publication by POF, which was studying a series of classes, and the use of technology. One of the reasons that allows greater complexity is because they are intended to be viewed online. So when you look at the publication itself, this figure is too small to read. But when you view it online and can explode it onto a screen, it becomes useful. It becomes thought-provoking. So what makes it complex? The simple answer is that this center column is she calls them themes. So on the left side, you got her qual data. And let's say these are conclusions from the qual data. And on the right, you have sorry. You have findings emerging from the quant. So you've like laid them out side by side. And again, I can imagine this as a great collaborative activity. Takes some time to unpack, no doubt about it. So by looking at by using the figure to look at the initial round of qual findings, initial round of quant findings, a set of themes were generated. She calls them mixed insights in this column. And the trick is, she didn't stop there. She didn't stop there. These insights then went on to become the basis of subsequent tables. So earlier on, I recognized that Fetters and Guterman in 2021, a very recent book put out by Tony Maguzzi and Brooke Johnson, have a chapter in there about joint displays. And they recognize joint displays as one or a series of joint displays. This is an example of that. So it's not that you need to understand the content of this. It's just that you've sort of summarized your qual findings on one side. You summarized your qual findings on the other side. You've created a set of what she calls mixed insight, which so far sounds like pillar integration, but you don't stop there. You take those themes and say you could go back to your qual data and analyze them by those themes. You could go back to your quant data and analyze them by those themes. Or you could, as Pof did, create a series, create a joint display for each one of these. So then you have this, which you could consider to be, it's a joint display, but it's an integrated, it integrates results. So it could be called an integrated results matrix. And then it went on to use these in subsequent tables. It's quite complex, quite sophisticated. Any of you who know Cheryl, who was president the year before me, and we were on the board a lot together. She writes a lot about complexity, which simply means that things are often very multi-level. So here, thinking about how a display can generate additional research themes for additional analysis. This is where it really gets cutting edge. So I have just a few slides about using visuals and data collection. And then after these slides, we'll give you a break. And then I'll get into some more of visual displays during analysis. Could write a whole book on the use of visual displays in data collection. I'll try to make this simple, or understandable. The idea is of using a display like a timeline. So let's take this timeline, which no graduate student could do research that spreads from 1950 to 2007. But let's just say you were talking about ideas of career. I did this in class with a set of graduate students once, and I asked them to annotate a timeline. So put years on the bottom when they first started to think about careers and the kind of pivotal events that led them to their choice of a career or graduate school. I can't remember if I did career or graduate school. So this becomes mixed data when you take a timeline and sit across with a participant, or perhaps you're on Zoom, and you ask a participant to talk more, because they're not usually self-explanatory. So, about a point that they have put on a timeline. And you ask them to enter what you would consider their qualitative data. This technique is under graphic elicitation. It's done a lot with photographs. As I mentioned earlier, using timelines, mapping activities, which I won't show you, I'm just going to concentrate on timelining, is a way to create a setting where participants or a group of participants, another possibility is you're with a group and you're trying to trace something that happened in the group. Maybe they're collaborators and you're trying to understand how they became effective collaborators and they plot out key events. So I really believe strongly that as compared to interviews, so this is, I've got some questions I'll come back to. So I'm going to say something controversial. I'm not a big fan of interview data. Surprise. I did a huge amount of interviewing in my day. And I'm not convinced that for most populations, it's the best way to collect data. I'm a huge fan of using data, by the way, that's available elsewhere. But I do believe that when you give a participant something to do, sort photographs, you had a session before this on Q-sort. I had a student that did Q. You give a participant something to do, something to attend to, that they can sit there and think about what you want them to think about it and talk about it spontaneously. It's a far more genuine way to collect data. You're going to get more authentic data, and it also works with diverse groups. Now, I want to show you something very, very unusual about this example, which I hope will spur some thinking in you. Let me explain it, because you could do the same thing if you use timelining. So if you're interested in, that's the word you want. If you want to look up other literature, the word you want is timelining. Some may call it qual, but you can quantify a timeline. This study was an incredibly ambitious study about poverty in Bangladesh. And really, this is a summary. So they used the timeline. So I'm talking about using it during data collection. They used it to lay out their data. So what was happening to these families at these different points of time? And they were interested in poverty rates. how to get people out of poverty, what pushed them into poverty. You could have a trend line for the same thing. So if you had on this axis a well-being score, for instance, or a mindfulness score, any kind of score, and on this axis, you've got a time dimension, then you create a trend line. So again, you could be talking about someone to collect data, or you could be using this to report data. Now notice this trend line, because the next slide is probably one of the two most innovative things in all of these presentations. This is sort of a up and down timeline, but notice it's mostly down. In this case, you've got poverty, income level over here. They went on to identify the trend lines. Here's a trend line, steady improvement. Here's a trend line, steady decline. Here's not much change, but up and down, and then etc. This is a joint display because they have taken the depiction, a description of the trend line, found a visual way to present it, and then quantified it for later analysis. So this using trend lines and quantifying them for further analysis is a great example of using a joint display for analysis. I'll show you before we break a very complicated but very recent example of the same idea of timelining. Now let me unpack this. More questions. Oh, I can't wait to answer these questions when we come back from break. This person I have met, and she has promised an article for a journal that I'm an editor on, but she sent this to me after she attended a workshop I did at ARA about visuals. This is timelining, and this is, there's been an article in the Journal of Mixed Methods about this TPAC thing. And this is tracing an individual's score over time and linking it to different data collected about a particular student. So this could be a class, it could be an emergency room, it could be a nonprofit center, but you're moving into case-based analysis, which I'll come back to. It's an individual. You've collected a lot of data about an individual, and then you're trying to understand this improving trend line. So here you have an improving trend line. These are hyperlinked to data. This is beyond my expertise going into these hyperlinks, using data as hyperlinks. So it's almost like something you might imagine in a spreadsheet. So most importantly, it's diverse data about a case assembled in a timeline, doesn't have to be assembled in a timeline. And then it is used when you do a cross-case comparison to generate new insight. So wrapping up before break, so a basic display, side by side, qual findings, quant findings. You generate some conclusions, but you shut the door. Now, you don't want to go further for paradigmatic reasons. You don't have proof of those. A complex display like this and the previous one, it's interactive, it's dynamic. You're generating ideas, you're testing ideas, you're moving back and forth in what Morgan writes about, an abductive approach, the pragmatic adaptive approach. You're trying to generate insight by considering multiple types of data. So let's stop there. I've gone a little further than I meant to. Been about an hour and 20 minutes. So let's take a 10-minute break, and then if you have time, post questions. I'll come back to questions before we move on. So I love questions. They really help. So take your 10-minute break and we'll be back. Mhm. Are you there, Rebecca?
Yes, I'm here.
I can't remember what time we went on break. So what time should we?
We can go ahead and start back now. I think it's been about 10 minutes.
Okay, that's great. Welcome back, everybody. Could you all turn your cameras on just for a minute so I can see what you look like? Just click that camera button and give me some faces to see. There's one. Thank you. Saw one person. I think I might give it just a few more minutes.
There's a few people that have their camera on. Della turned hers on.
Thank you.
Francisca,
Oh yeah, there, I see now. Hi, Francisca.
Maria, and Anissa,
Lisa, Erica, you have a
Mona.
question I'm going to come back to. Cool, thank you. People, real people.
Julie turned hers on, I think.
Hey, Della. Oh, Julie, yes. This is very encouraging. Oh, it's so much fun. I recognize some names too. I have a cat attending. Let me go back. I'll start back in, and I know people will be joining us. Let me go back to a question from MK. So who's MK? Can I see MK's face? Is MK back yet? Hey, Hongming, I remember you. He or she may not be back.
I think that's Maria. Is that Maria? Maria, if you unmute and say something, then I think your picture would pop
Yeah,
up.
it's me. I'm MK.
Who's MK? Where is MK? Oh, wait a minute.
Oh,
Let me
yeah.
find you. Where are you? I have to look across the bottom. Okay. Let me go back. She asked a question. MK asked a question. Can you use, let me go back to where that question was. Yes, someone has a question about joining. Do you have an example of a joint display from an exploratory study showing how qual data builds into quant survey items? So let me go back a couple slides to this slide from Howell Smith, who, oh, I lost it there, sorry. Who was using mixed methods with grounded theory for her dissertation, I believe. So this joint display could be exploratory, it could be explanatory. But if you start with the qual stage, which I believe that she did, and you code your qual, and this column is your qual, is the constructs that emerged from your qual analysis. And here's an illustrative quote to sort of show audience members that this is real. It was in my data. I'm proving to you, this is warranty. I'm proving to you it was in my data. I didn't make these constructs up. So here are, in this case, from a first phase exploratory qualitative analysis. And these, she's showing the parallels between the qual constructs in this last column, which is survey items. So this is a joint display that's called an instrument development display. Now, another way a similar display could be approached is if you start with a theoretical framework that came from the literature. And then this column is items from the literature. I might have talked myself into a corner there because I'm not sure then it would be a joint display because it isn't from your own analysis. So these could be related to theory, but this whole point is to show the connection between the qualitative data and your survey items. So this is a very widely used form of joint display. So let me go to, yeah, Erica asks, no doubt, inspired by this sort of scary figure, you know, that you have to admit that when you look at this figure, it's not particularly inviting in that, you know, where do you begin? Where's the entry point? You assume there's a left to right orientation, but this is not a simple figure. And then actually she gives the rationale for using such complexity. She had many sources of data and she's pulling them together. So I would say to Erica, two things. One, there's a difference between the display, or there can be a difference, but between a display that you use to generate insight and how you report it. So in this case, it's one and the same. As I said, this was a team project. And you can imagine that a team sat together and drew all these lines. And this was a talking point. A figure like this is highly dependent on the text that surrounds it.
And that's one of the reasons I resist the idea of systematic reviews that try to isolate these and analyze them and classify them without considering what's in the text. So once you get to reporting, it's expected that you're gonna tell the reader some important takeaways from this, not that the reader might not also take more away. So the text that surrounds a table like this is very important. How you show it is different. Most people that use models like this, they go through many revisions, and as you present it, become more and more straightforward and simplified. But it's a real, I'm saying you consider one thing when you're generating ideas from it and another thing when you get to reporting. 12:38 a.m. in the Philippines. Whoa. One of my students is presenting tomorrow, and to watch him, I would have to get up at 4 a.m. So it's a challenge. Ramona says, are joint displays more of an art and science rather than theory behind constructing one? It's like that answer, there's multiple answers to it. You're adapting it to your circumstances and what is useful in your circumstance. So it's not like you must have you must have this and you must have this and you must have this. It's like, does this, like with this complex figure, putting it out on a whiteboard or scratching it out on a piece of paper with a group, would this help you? So it's really a matter of as they adapt to your setting. You start out with one idea, but they're dynamic and they progress. I am glad to share. Yes. Oh, it's been recorded for me. And if you email me, CREAMERE, I can send you, here's my email in the chat. I can send you the recording, assuming it'll go over the bandwidth. Okay, so let me talk about a few more and then see, I want to ask you in a little bit, what ideas you have, what could be useful to you before we get too much further. But let me do a few more slides. Let me come back to this slide. So here's a complex display, yours doing analysis. One of these was created for each student in the class. So this is like a portfolio for a student. And the data are being looked at together. So this is a far different approach than a conventional basic design where you might analyze all the concept maps and you know, separately from the blog. So you might have devoted some time to analyzing blogs in one phase and concept maps in another, and their final project in another. And they're all separated in phases. In this case, you're bringing them, this is a profoundly different approach. You're bringing the data together about, in this case, a student. So this is a tool for analysis, and then you compare student A and student B, and what differences do you see? So this is just the first step in the analysis. That may seem complex and incredibly difficult to accomplish, but I'll give you some more examples of this case-based, which honestly, let's switch to case-based analysis using joint displays for case-based analysis. So the previous one, that's what that is. So your data are the displays. Your data are the displays. Maybe I'll give you another example of how your data could be the display. Maybe you're interested in people's access to healthy food or access to food, and you've got maps of the area, and you sat down with your participants and they traced where they went, and then the map and the students' comments on the map are your data, or the students' annotation of a timeline is your data, are your data. So this is when a visual display becomes data for you to analyze. This is not the door shuts at the end, you know, at the end. This is like at the midpoint. So case-based analysis is when qualitative and quantitative data are integrated in a narrative or visualization to create a holistic understanding or multidimensional understanding for uses of further analysis. So it's a case. You build cases with a visual display. This is pretty cutting edge. A few people have using case studies is not cutting edge, but using visuals as case studies is cutting edge. Baisley says that case-based analysis is the single strongest way to integrate data. So you could use cases to build understanding, or you could use them in an explanatory way to test a theoretical framework. So let me give you some more examples. This example is recent. So notice how recent some of these are. This example comes from Tashane Haynes Brown's dissertation. Tashane is from Trinidad, I believe. And she teamed up with Dr. Fetters after she finished her dissertation to figure out a way to display her data in a joint display. And her unit of analysis was groups of, it could have been groups. So let's say it was groups. So she was exploring, she was working with teachers. And she's written 2 articles. It's very contemporary research. The point is, she's created a visual display that has her qualitative data, her quantitative data displayed about her teacher. And she is for a case-based analysis to make sense of her findings together, rather than saying, you know, part 1 in the results section is teacher scores on this, and then part 2 separated is what they said in this case. She did observations and she also did interviews. So she's trying to understand teachers' conceptions of whether they were of their own pedagogy about how they taught. So this is, Fetters has some examples of these in his manual that comes from 2020. So this is a fairly recent example of case-based that combines graphing. Now, a takeoff of this would be, let's say that you were doing an intervention and you had a group of people that, wow, they blew the top off. The intervention was just perfect for them. It hit the mark, got the outcomes they wanted, perfect. So you've got group one, positive outcomes, intended outcomes. And you created a way to combine, like this, a display that combines the quantitative data about these people that were successful and the qualitative data. And then let's say you had another group and it was a bust. Let's say it was a smoking cessation program. You tried to create something to discourage people from smoking. And then you had one group that actually ended up smoking more after the intervention. The intervention probably made them so nervous or something that they were smoking more. And you got one group that was smoking less. So a case-based analysis will let you look at all the data you have about the people who benefited and all the data about the people who backtracked. So it allows you to bring the data at some point in the analysis. So these are for sure, more advanced designs than you are familiar with, or that have been given the most attention. So I mentioned some of the purposes of using visual displays as a tool for analysis. You can achieve the same thing in qualitative software by combining your data about the case. And, like in qualitative software, your data could include pictures or student art, different things. So I mentioned the second one as a way to promote multidimensional thinking. You can use it in an exploratory way to generate theory, to make hypotheses or propositions about it. Or I mentioned you could use them to deductively test a theory. I'm arguing that they promote creativity and new insight. For readers, you use this word, they provide proof about the connection between your data and your findings. And overall, they're intended to offset the experimentation, the playing with them helps you helps you skirt the tendency, which we all have, to force preconceptions on the data. Because the more you experiment with your data and the deeper you get into it, the more obvious it can become that your preconceptions might be inaccurate. So let me pause there for a minute and see. I want to stop here. It's 12:58, so we've been going about 2 hours. A half hour, no, it's 1. I forgot when we end. 11:30, 12:30, 1:30. We probably won't go the whole time. So let's stop there for a minute before I go on and talk a little bit about some other issues. I want you to pause here for 5 or 10 minutes and maybe ask you to pause yourself and think about, can you flip back through the joint displays and see if there are any that you could modify and be useful in your own research. So I'd really like to stop here for 10 minutes or 15 minutes here and let you do a little bit of doodling or drawing, or I don't know if you still use paper, if you do it on your computer. I suggest here that you sketch out any ideas that you have about how you could use a visual display, a joint, most specifically a joint display. If that idea of putting qual and quant data in a table or figure could be useful to you. So let me give you a little bit of time to do that. So it's one, let's do 5 to 8, 10 minutes. Do some sketching. And then I'll ask you to tell me a little bit about what ideas you've come up with so we can actually hear from you more specifically before I get into sort of at the end of my slides. Any questions there about what I'm asking you to do here? For the person who just joined us, we've been underway about 2 hours, and let me just give you an update of what's happening right now. We're taking a pause, and people are, I hope, scribbling and drawing madly. We're trying to visualize, draw, or diagram the outline, the sketch of a visual display, a joint display that might be useful in their own research. So that's why we're kind of in a quiet space right here. We're going to come back in like 5 minutes, and I'm going to ask people to talk about the ideas that are taking shape in their own minds. So I may even call on some people. No pressure. We just had another person join us, so I imagine the logistics are very complicated here. So we're got a few more minutes. People are sketching out ideas about joint displays that might be useful to them. Figures and tables that they could prove useful in their own research projects. And then as we continue over the next however long we go, maybe 1 more hour, people can begin to modify that and add to it or tweak it. Because there is some art to this. In one of the examples, I'm going to show you a little bit, and he's the one presenting at 4 a.m. my time at this conference. Michael Peters, he said he figured there were at least 60. His visual display went through at least 60 iterations, 60 different versions, not completely different, but he continued to tweak it over the life of his dissertation. So these are dynamic and malleable. All right, a few more minutes. All right, so I have the photos pulled up, and I'm hoping some of you will be willing to, I don't know, I don't think I can see you raise your hands. I don't think this is the software that allows you to raise your hands, is it? But you know what you could do? You could just turn your camera on. If, and maybe Rebecca can help me because I can't quite get see enough people at one time, and I know there's different options. So who wants to tell us about ideas they're beginning to get about a joint display that could be useful? Oh, this is better. This is better. Okay, I see some pictures. Shall I call on someone? How about Julie? I love the name Julie. Julie Zadinsky. Can you unmute yourself and tell us if you have any ideas about how you might use it? What ideas are beginning to come to your mind about joint displays and visual displays?
Yeah, there are so many different possibilities, which is one thing that's good about it, but also can make it difficult, as you know. So I'm not coming up with any real good ideas right away. We do have one study we haven't reported on yet. We've done collected some quantitative data in terms of instruments, then did some focus groups, which is a little different, of course, than the interviews, and trying to marry up the focus groups with how the instruments kind of came out. They can kind of validate it generally, but the point by point, like you were displaying before, that was so good, was kind of hard to get.
Yeah, they call it an integrated results matrix. When you say you have your constructs on the far left, and you line up what you learn, you know, you're finding from your instrument on that construct next to insight from that the focus group, and that's bread and butter and integrated. It's a joint display. Another word for it is an integrated results matrix. And, you know, part of the excitement of those kind of displays isn't only in the confirmation. So yes, check. There's agreement on these items, and there's agreement on this item, and agreement on that item or construct. But it's also where there's where they don't jive, and the exploration that that can lead to try to understand why the findings are different. That adds like a whole nother layer of understanding of your data. So usually they're gonna match on, let's say, 8 out of 10. But particularly when it's complex, you're gonna always have cases where they seem to be telling different stories. So this is an integrated result, a joint display that's an integrated results matrix. The disjunct is every bit as interesting as, in fact, sometimes theoretically more significant than where they agree. Vicki Plano Clark and a student of hers, Saunders, and I've got this in the slide at the end, is the one who coined the expression integrated results matrix in a publication in 2015. That language hasn't been widely adopted, but that integrated results matrix is from Plano Clark and Saunders. It's a very useful term. Very succinct way to summarize it, very helpful to the reader to draw attention to the ways there's agreement and disagreement. Very, very solid kind of joint displays.
Thank you.
Sure. Someone else.
There is a way to raise your hand on the computer if you click reactions. There's a raise hand
Okay.
next to the name, you'll see the little raise hand. I can monitor that for you.
Oh, thanks. So let me call on, let's see. Should I call on somebody else? Francesca Ortez Ruiz. Francesca, I love that name. What are you thinking?
Hi, yes.
Hi.
Can you hear me, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So hi, I was thinking about, so for sure this is not a good exercise. So I was like trying to think about it. And I was thinking specifically one of my researches in which I use life history and social network approach. So what I did, I was having the life history, the narratives, and also things that are super quantitative in the classic sense of it. And there were like obviously the dates or the people who were involved. So I was thinking about that and how all of those stuff could be embedded in a timeline.
Yeah, exactly
Like
what
not
I was
only,
thinking.
yeah, not
Yeah.
like not only with the event, but also with the narrative embedded in it. Like I could add some narratives, I could add some images, I could add many things, but maybe not so many. So it could be very crowded, but something like that I was trying to sketch. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a perfect fit with a timeline. Life Course is interested, as I understand it, I'm no expert, you probably know more than I do, in critical turning events. Person named Evans has done some work with, but he didn't use timeline. She didn't use timelines. That's a perfect pairing with a timeline. How much you annotated it during the conversation or during your analysis is different again from what you show. That helps you see the critical turning points that I understand are so essential to Life Course. So Life Course and timeline, that Life Course is a method. I guess it's considered qual, but it's so readily mixed methods.
Yeah.
Once you have other kinds of data as well. So there's another idea for people, the life course perspective. It's a fairly simple sort of theory. Looking for critical turning points is part of what it's trying to do, why it's such a good fit.
Yeah.
Good example.
Thanks.
Thanks. All right. If anybody got their hands up, Rebecca? Or shall I scroll?
No hands up.
How about Celicia? Celicia? Did I say your name correctly? Do you have any ideas? Celicia? Mohammed. Oh, she may not be there. Okay. I feel like I'm in an Easter egg hunt here. See, these examples are great, and I know you're like hesitant to speak. Anyone else before calling somebody? How about Anissa? Anissa, are you there?
Hello. Sorry, I'm still in my early phase of my PhD, so I haven't collected data yet. So I'm more of just trying to get lots of ideas.
Okay. All right, too soon for you. No worries. How about Leah? Looks familiar. I wonder if I've met Leah. Let me just do one or two more. Leah, did you get any
I didn't
ideas?
get the opportunity to do it. My apologies. I'm trying to work a meeting at the same time as the workshop. Right. I sent you an email as well, so you'll understand.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Oh dear. All right, one more. Who's got anyone?
David has his hand up.
Yay. Okay.
I think I unmuted my mic there. Yeah, I see a lot of work in mixed methods that uses what I think Cresswell and Plano Clark would call a convergent design. And so people collect their data rather separately and then attempt to integrate them in the analysis. And often they're trying to kind of compare what they found qualitatively and what they found quantitatively. And it seems to me that's an area where some kind of joint display could be really helpful. A lot of times people just seem to go down two separate paths and never get it to come back together.
Yeah.
And so I was thinking along those lines.
That's helpful because I can imagine, and I know this sounds ridiculous, but almost like a design that looks like a goalpost. A goalpost. So like a football goalpost, you know. So it's like you said, that you begin with some initial analysis of your data from your different sources. You clean it up, and that, you know, maybe it's parallel, maybe you've got two team members, maybe you move back and forth between, but they're separate and parallel, convergent, you begin with a convergent design. It assumes you collect the data separately, but you could, of course, as you know, apply to data that's, say, if you were extracting data from social media, which the qualitative software allows you. So you could analyze them separately and gain familiarity, gain insight, and then you bring them together in an integrated, a preliminary integrated model or figure, or those case-based analysis to kind of move to an integrated phase of analysis. So I think that these often combine. They start at the basic design where they're separate, and then they bring it together in a joint display or a case-based analysis. Is a very clear way to do that. So a couple questions in the, is it possible to use, yes, I'm doing that, yes. This is from Mar. Is it possible to use a framework a theoretical framework from the literature, I'm looking at inequalities across the cancer pathway and using a candidacy framework where I think I can display quant and qual data along. Oh, that's great. He's asking about starting with a framework. And I happen to be writing on just that right now. I think there is no more rigorous way to pursue research than to start with a theoretical framework, a theoretical model. It could be an off-the-shelf one, or it could be one, you know, a recognizable one, or it could be one that you construct from the literature. And essentially, then that is when this idea that I introduced earlier, possibly before you came in, that's when the new twist in 2021 that talks about one or more displays, so that it begins to think of joint displays not just as singular. So why does that matter with theoretical, when you begin with a theoretical framework? It could be a curriculum framework, like a curriculum guide, like they have for teaching online. That's a framework. And there's implementation theories that talk about stages. So it identifies the stages, it sort of gives you a starting place. So why I say that is there is no more rigorous way to build research. If you take those core constructs and build them across a number of tables and figures. So you start out by showing how the core constructs are embedded in your data collection instruments, how the core concepts are embedded in your findings. So that's called a findings to theory table. So that is a very, very strong way to embed quality in a mixed method study, is to start with some kind of framework that has been built from the literature or that exists in the literature. This is really a good point. Now see, Ramona, you bring up the very ish. Ramona is responding to Morgan. And I don't think, honestly, she quite was getting his point, to be honest, in that he talked about a concurrent design and then was suggesting that a joint display would be a good way to bring them together. This is, Ramona put her finger on exactly the tension, the pushing of boundaries that using a joint display for analysis introduces. And that is, in my view, a very positivist idea, that integration is the last step, that you draw meta inferences at the last step. That's a hardcore assumption behind much of the first 2 generations of literature mixed methods. So once you begin using visual displays during data collection, say with grounded theory, and you're collecting and analyzing data simultaneously, you're bringing qual and quant together simultaneously. It sort of blows the water out of the idea that you can wait until the end to bring them together. So you're right that it unsettles that idea. It unsettles that idea. I've been a big reader of Pat Baisley's work. I know her work very, very well. She says things sometimes so cogently. So she joins another big leader in our field, Margaret Sandalewski. You draw inferences at every stage of the research process. It is very, very positivist to assume that you cannot draw conclusions, you cannot interpret until the last stage. That is a very, I don't know what the right word is. I don't want to say it's a very non-qualitative approach. But that is, Ramona put her finger on an issue I'm going to come back to. It raises an issue. Oh, Celicia responded. Celicia, you want to talk? You want to turn your mic on? Yes, I see Ramona. Morgan responds
Yeah.
to Ramona.
Dr. Creamer, sorry about it. I was speaking and, forgot completely that the mic was,
Oh, I'm sorry.
So I think basically in my novice experience here with mixed method, I would want to say I'm using exploratory sequential design, and I collect the qualitative data first, following analysis when I develop my themes and so on. I would now display that, and well, of course, I would use vignettes and so on to support the themes, and findings that I may have used from the qualitative to develop my survey instrument for my quantitative data. I would now try to display the quantitative sections in that table to see, whether there are any similarities, and I would think possibly differences.
Yes.
So you can clearly identify the findings and I guess analysis as to what is coming out of that data. I think that's my thought on it at this moment. I'm not sure if I'm in the correct
Yes,
pathway.
and then you realize that when you line them up, it's going to reveal some things to you that you might not have been familiar with before. So when you line them up, whether you do it in a database or whether you do it on Excel, or whether you do it on a visual display, some things are going to come out that are new. And that's how they can be dynamic, synthetic. They can produce their own level of insight, whether you stop then and go back and re-explore. Like if you do find contradictions in the previous example, then you must explain them. So quality demands that if you laid your findings out in an integrated result matrix and you lined up your survey data and your focus group data, for instance, and there are gaps, then you need a sentence that says the differences, it's possible that the differences are explained by this or by this. So you may not pursue them, you may choose not to pursue them, but you're obligated to give your reader an explanation for when they don't jive. Otherwise the reader's going to think, she didn't notice that they didn't jive. And they're not consistent.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Yeah. Any other questions over here? Well, this is so helpful to me. It really, these questions, sometimes people say things that, often people say things in workshops that I'm like, it helps me in my writing to try to explain things by understanding how people understand, how people's questions help me, often really help me. So let's go back to the slides now. Let's see if I can shrink this little guy down. So I'm going to move that one.
Tilanka has her hand, or he has a hand raised.
Did you say Ilanka?
It's Tilanka.
Oh,
it's a she.
Beautiful, beautiful name. Go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Creamer. I am actually quite interested with what Dr. Morgan said as well. So I'm also on a convergent parallel design sort of an approach at the moment, and trying to display or sort of integrate my findings. What I'm at the moment trying to grapple here is when I have a multi-sample, for example, I have teachers and also the principals of the schools giving feedback or giving information. So I have quantitative information for both the teachers and the principals, qualitative information of both teachers and principals. And I seem to find, I'm trying to find a way how I could actually display this using a joint display. Any thoughts would be most helpful.
Oh, it's making me think of a study where Cooper did a study similar. You have what they call multi-level data. She did too. Principals. She had principals, parents, and students. And so she analyzed all those data separately initially and generated insight from each of those. So there's you starting with you could call it concurrent or parallel design. So they analyze each of those sources of data separately, generating, let's call them themes. So this particular group talked a lot about these topics. This group talked a lot about these topics, and this group talked a lot about these topics. Or they emphasize these topics. That alone would make an interesting joint display. Because they're not going to emphasize the same thing because they're coming from different perspectives. It's like I said, it's a multi-level design. Still, I mean, a multi-level sampling strategy. So just even the topics that are highlighted by the groups would be an interesting joint, would be an interesting joint display. Now you could say that's all qual, informed by quant, but that would be an interesting place to start when you have different groups like that who are going to emphasize different things. What Cooper did, so she started independently, and then we got the goalpost design again. If you figure first quant and qual analysis separately, then she brought them together into what she called blended themes. So she found themes that cross the groups when she moved into a more integrated analysis. And then often that could require going back to small sets of data and reconsidering it. But just a display that talks about the different things discussed by different groups, and then your speculation, informed as it is by your understanding of the data, about why they're talking about different things, why they're emphasizing different things. This could be true if you're studying different schools or principals in different schools. Different schools are different, so they might emphasize different things. So the important thing is not just to look for commonalities, but to see what the discordances teach you about the person or about the environment.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Delith is commenting, I can see now how I could have taken things further with timelining. I could have focused on the phase. Well, Delith, that's another paper. It's another dissertation. It's not your dissertation. You have to finish dissertation. It's ideas for the future. What more analysis you could do to build on what you've already done. So that's another really important use. I love the thinking that's starting to perk. Let me go back to the slides and come back to a couple more ideas. So this is let me see if I can get my screen a little was busy here. I'll put the chat. This is a fairly old I guess you could call it a cluster map. And again, I want to talk about possibilities. I want you to see this. I want to propose this as where you could go from this kind of visual display. This is produced by qualitative software. It doesn't matter which one because they all could produce these kinds of maps. And you, the researcher or the investigator, is the one that draws these shapes. So let me make that point first. So right here, the investigator is making choices. So they've analyzed their qual data, they've coded it, and these numbers are not at all what you think they are. These are lines of text, probably could be observations, but it's probably from interview data. And the software will cluster them in terms of similarity and types of language used. But the investigator is the one that draws these shapes and says, well, here's a different set of constructs, and I'm going to call them time factors. When I go back and I look at my data, and I'm going to call these time factors. This happened to be a study about food deserts. I'm a foodie in my spare time, and so I always read anything about food deserts. And so these are factors influencing choices about food. This makes more sense when you think of it this way. So you've identified similar comments. You've actually gone and added another layer of analysis. You pulled up all the data in this group. And again, qualitative software will allow you to do that. Will allow you to see all the data that falls in here. And then you might call that personal decisions. You might call this group health consciousness. You might call this time factors. So this right here is a descriptive visual. Could debate whether this is a joint display. Those are only line numbers. But you can see some dimension of quantity in there by how many lines are devoted to it. If you stop at this point, this is descriptive. You've come up with categories of the kinds of considerations that people have. And the software has helped you do that in a very helpful way. But again, you could take this further by doing a closer analysis or adding data that you have available to you, quantitative data that you have available to you that can help you better understand who is in these different groups. So it's, again, it's not a starting point, it's more like a midpoint that it can generate further analysis of groups. So it's really just a starting place. Now, in that Plano and Clark article, this is a simple one. So you can breathe a sigh of relief. I'm actually showing a fairly simple one. This is also language introduced by Plano, Clark, and Sanders in that 2015 article, and I've got the reference. Here's a simple joint display that's called a findings to theory display. And a question, someone asked a question about using theory. Now, I think this was a master's thesis in nursing. And they're using Maslow's hierarchy. which I think many people, and certainly in education and many applied field, are familiar with this widely used theory that has these levels of need. So this is a joint display that's showing how the findings line up with the theory and where they don't line up. So the top is empty. And this is an example of what I've said before. The top is saying she's got no variables, nothing coded in the top. She is building on the theory by showing her interpretation of her data, how these needs were shown. And so these are the quantitative factors and these are the qualitative factors. She used a pyramid because that theory is hierarchical. This is where people get into some pretty attractive figures when you've got a model like this. So this is another, she explains, or I think it's a she, explains in this finding to theory joint display. This would likely appear in the discussion of an article. So you come back to theory there in the discussion. She offers an explanation for why this is absent of her group. This was a study with immigrant families, and it her explanation fits the theory that they are mostly concentrated in lower orders. So I show you this to introduce this idea of a findings to theory joint display. So part of my goal was to help you be more, to find descriptive language for your own table. You could call it theory to findings as well. This is a good example because it's so simple. Now, one of her colleagues, who I believe is presenting and is probably known to some of the people here, at the time this came out in 2009, this is a joint display in the form of a theoretical model. At the time this came out, I believe it was the first of its kind. And this student, Yoko Kawamura from Japan, was collaborating with an important person in our field, Natalia Ivankova. And this is just a marvelous integrated joint display. It combines qualitative and quantitative data to produce a model about the effect of an intervention. This is an endpoint. So she's creating a holistic picture. She uses a legend to show you with ovals her qual data, a rectangle her quant data, and then this soft borders where she has data on both. And then, so the legend and annotation, this can be called, this is an integrated results matrix. It's not a matrix, it's a model. It could be called an integrated theoretical model, in that she's generated a theoretical framework by looking at her qual and quant data all together in terms of her desired outcomes. So here she's got her desired outcomes, the inputs, steps people went through. So this is an integrated theoretical model. It's a joint display. She's got quant and qual data shown together. She is showing where she has strong data to support it, the darker lines, and where she has weak data, the dotted lines. So she's recognizing areas of where she's only got, these are very tentative conclusions. So this is showing you using different textual techniques the shading, different box sizes, arrows, and they sort of add a layer of meaning to that. So she didn't start with a theoretical model, but she integrated her findings in a theoretical model that others might find useful. Several people since that Shim did this, and she's presenting in a session about mixed method grounded theory. There's several other people that have done this since, but this is certainly the first one I ever saw. Now, this is by far the most creative example I have seen. And this came out in December. And this comes back to the idea of a series of joint displays. Now, this is really cutting edge. It's almost hard to imagine. But I'll flip forward. So this comes back to the idea. So Peters, he's the one presenting at 4 a.m. He's presenting at this conference. He created essentially a set of joint displays using the pillar integration we talked about earlier about each of his constructs. He brought the qualitative data and the quantitative together about the constructs in a framework he was using. And the framework was about instruction. And then he generated these themes. I think he had 3 joint displays, which he then, I know I'm probably blowing your mind here, but this is so innovative. And I wrote a little bit about this in an article that's in the reference list. And then he put each ring of his final figure aligns his findings. So he collapses it into what is called a meta joint display. This is sort of like we're now at the top of the mountain in terms of innovative. This is the one that I mentioned that I talked to him about this figure, and he said it went through at least 60 different, this was his dissertation. It probably went through 60 different iterations. He was working with a Spanish colleague, Sergei Fabrique, who's been, I know through MMIRA. And I think he said he got some of the ideas from a workshop that Sergei did. So this is another type of integrated joint display, very, very complex display. Okay, so I think, so let's open to questions, and then I've just got some, before I open to questions, let me make one point, and then let's go to questions, because I've just got one more slide after this, and it's 10 to 2. Part of the reason that I have been able, in both my mixed method grounded theory book and in the book I'm writing about visual displays, part of the reason I have I can produce so many creative examples is because I read very widely. I read outside of what Maxwell refers to as the silo of people within the mixed methods community. So when you go out to practice, it's practice that guides these examples. It's what I see in practice. The examples produced in practice. I mean, literally hundreds and hundreds of examples that, now that's an exaggeration. I don't have hundreds and hundreds, I probably have 50 examples, and I'm stopping myself from finding any more. But look at the journals where they were published. So of all my examples, 3 did come from the Journal of Mixed Methods Research. Thus, pillar integration is one of those. But look at this list of other journals. You've got nursing journals, you've got educational psychology, the one I showed you about the time orientation, got a couple from higher education. This was the timelining example. This was the one that came from qualitative software that's like a cluster analysis. Another one from family nursing, another one from higher education, research, and development. Now, not everybody uses the label joint display. That's pretty restricted to our community of insiders. But if you use visual displays or you use figures and tables in your search terms, like the timelining thing, if you use the terms timelining and you go broad, you're going to find a lot of creative examples outside of the sometimes narrow world of reading that a lot of people in mixed methods restrict themselves to. Reading, of course, in your own discipline. So this is a topic, joint displays is a topic that is new enough. I pointed to it's 2011. It's only about 10 years, which is new. It's you could play a role in introducing people in your own discipline to different types of figures. If you're thinking about a methodological article, for example, for instance, a person doing timelining. After some day down the road, I think it was Francesca, she might want to write a methodological article about using mixed methods with timelining. The other person doing life course, that was the same person, a methodological article about the life course. So you really have to cast a broad net to find the full ways that practice sort of illustrates creative uses that are not always apparent, I guess that's what I would say. So let's open it for questions before my last slide, which kind of comes back to implications. So I know that's probably a lot of information. We've gone from basic to very advanced. Most people are going to use a combination. Most people are going to start with basic. Daleth put an example of a screenshot. She may have some example. It would be so fun. We had a way to share some of these examples. So what kind of things should we talk a little bit about? Rebecca, if you can see anybody has hands or questions.
I don't see any hands up, so.
Thanks. So the most basic joint display is a findings to results by construct. That's a great way. That's a great way to begin. That's a very good way to begin. So let me wrap up with just some suggestions. But as we move to thinking about using this as during analysis, which is a recent discussion. If you look back at my timeline, Haynes Brown sort of began that discussion in her work with Fetters, using it for case-based analysis. It has a lot of implications for the way we think of how that type of mixed methods could be used. We've talked already about it introduces the idea that you draw inferences earlier in the process, not just at the end. It affects guidelines in that, well, how far do you go with, so the guidelines for best practice about figure, how complex can they be before they're meaningless to anyone but you? Procedural diagrams, we're used to procedural diagrams that has implications for procedural diagrams. We're used to those kind of flowcharts that try to capture the whole process from data collection to data analysis and inferences. In this kind of work, you tend to see them focused on analysis, particularly when you're using existing data like social media. Those kinds of flowcharts that show your design can really benefit by targeting analysis. And then we already talked about the idea that you might start with that concurrent, the idea Dr. Morgan brought up. You might start with that concurrent analysis, separate analysis of each of your sources of data, and then bring it together in a joint display like we saw that fancy outline, that fancy timeline that had the hyperlinks. Where you place your joint display in your article or in your dissertation, is it in the, what in my day would have been the discussion section where you bring your results together, or is it a result? Does it belong in a section of the article called integration results? So you let the reader know integration results. So question. Oh, good question, Ramona. What part of the research process does a joint display play a more significant role? Or does its place where it's needed? For instance, you can use it in data analysis or sampling. Yes, yes, yes. There's a very fine example of a joint display where they use 3 Venn diagrams to plot their qual and quant data to use in sampling. So I think you've answered it. It's like, where does it play a role? Where is it most useful in your study? Where are you going to bring them together? So like if you're in the sampling example, here you're bringing your data together at sampling. You might then go on and just do qual case studies and not come back to your integrated data, but you use it at sampling. So it really does point to it points to their variety. It points to their variety in the way, as soon as you start bringing that data together and you're thinking in a more complex way, that's when it's useful. When you think of them as the full range. Nice question. Any last words? Let me see. Let me see. Yes, I mentioned that I had a reading list. This is the article that introduces, number one is the article that has been a big influence to me in emphasizing different uses and types of visual displays. This 2015 article by Plano Clark. This is other stuff that I have written, including this recent editorial that talked about the example of the of a series, using a series of displays and merging them into a circular display. I'd never seen that done before. So honestly, I get most of my ideas by looking at what people have done rather than making them up out of whole cloth. Dr. Morgan, you got anything you want to add out there? Did he leave? Or he's muted? No, he's still there. All right, any questions about resources, references, software, anything like that before we wrap up? Oh, yes, yes. Yes. This is the journal. Thank you, David. This is the journal that I am the editor. I'm the editor for the mixed methods. So Dr. Morgan has put a site in, and this is the result of a systematic review. He's right. They're always so helpful. And this is Sergey, who I mentioned before too. And they have a table in that article that probably lists 20 or 30 examples, I'm guessing, something like that. So it's a very nice listing to work with as examples, and it's an open access journal, so you can readily get the site. So this is new. In the same issue, there's a review by McCruden on of its use in psychology. So Tim McCruden has written two things about how joint displays have been used in psychology, and one of them is in that same special issue that was with methods in psychology. Good tip. The nice thing about joint displays, there's probably 6 publications total that are out there about it. Several that involve Guterman and Fetters, and several that I've done. There's not a lot, so it's a fairly cutting edge topic. All right, I think I'll wrap up. I think we're right here, almost to time. So thank you all so much. I'm so glad you're here. I'm so excited to see so many. I hope you really enjoy the conference. I hope you meet a lot of cool people in Zooming land and come away with so many ideas. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you guys. Thanks for being here. It's so exciting to have you see MMIRA again. Bye-bye. No worries about being late. All right. And Rebecca too. Yes, thank you, Rebecca, for organizing this. Oh, thank you, Dallas. Feel